Good afternoon, everyone. Hello, and welcome to today's virtual roundtable supporting BIPOC community members. This roundtable is the final program in a broader mental health series that Akuhuai is offering in partnership with NERSA and in collaboration with ACCCO. Your membership dollars fund today's program and all of our efforts in this space, and we sincerely thank you for your support and for being here with us today and every day. My name is Lori Sabata, and I will be serving as the technical director for the program today. Today we are joined by an outstanding panel of professionals who bring a variety of perspectives to this conversation. But before I pass the program to today's moderator, I want to go over a few quick housekeeping points. These virtual roundtables are designed in a conversation format as opposed to a traditional webinar. We see these programs as an opportunity for all to engage, connect, and really be an active part of the program. So please be ready and willing to offer your questions and insights along the way. Throughout the program, you can submit questions using your Q&A button, which you can find on your Zoom menu. Again, please feel free to submit these as we go along. As you enter these questions and comments, please know that questions are viewable to all attendees and panelists. If a colleague submits a question that you would also like to be addressed, please be sure to upvote the question so that it is flagged for us to ask live. The chat function is also available to you if you would like to make a point or ask things of other attendees. Another function that you have available to you is the raised hand function, which allows you to alert us if you are having any technical difficulties. If you can see us and hear us, okay, I'm going to ask you that if you could please just go ahead and find that looks like a little raised hand on your, should be a bar on the bottom of your screen. Go ahead and hit that raised hand, and that lets me know that you can hear instructions and you can see the screen. I see lots of raised hands, so thank you so much for doing that. Appreciate it. All right, so we're going to jump into today's program. I am now going to pass the virtual microphone over to today's moderator and Akuhuai Executive Board member, Louis. Welcome, Louis.
Hey, thank you. Thank you, Lori. Hi, all. We're just kind of a quick roadmap. We're going to go ahead and introduce ourselves. I'll then be asking the panel a very broad question and jump into a couple of other questions. And then ideally, as you have questions, please make sure to use the Q&A function there. My name is Luis Jimenez Inoa. I'm the Associate Dean of the College at Vassar College for Student Living and Wellness here. And I'll be moderating today's panel. I'll turn that over to Bati.
Hi, everyone. Batirai Bunzabaya, but I go by Bati. I use she, her pronouns. And I'm the Director of Outreach and Prevention Services at the Counseling Center at the University of Pennsylvania. And I'm also a ACCCO board member as well. So welcome. I'm happy to be here with all of you.
Hello and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Earl Cabellon. I use he, him pronouns from the University of Maryland, College Park. And I work for University Recreation and Wellness as the Assistant Director overseeing HR and Student Development. In my managerial portfolio, I sit on our senior leadership team for RecWell. I have oversight of a full-time coordinator for student personnel, and I lead departmental initiatives on leadership development to nearly 500 student employees and manage all the HR functions for our 45 professional staff. I'm the son of 2 immigrants from the Philippines, and my parents came to this country in the 70s. And so I identify as Filipino Filipinx. And I have an older sibling. Some of you may know him in the student affairs world, Ed Cabellon, a younger sister. And I'm married to my partner, Angela Lagdameo Cabellon, for about 7 years. And we are parents to an amazing 4-year-old son named Elijah. And I'm happy to be here with you all today.
Hello, I am Victoria Lopez Herrera, and I identify as Latina by social cultural identity, a Chicanista by social political identity. I am a first-generation college student, a mother and partner. I have 2 little brown people that I adore, and I currently reside in the indigenous land of Yanaguana, which today is referred to as San Antonio, Texas. I am also an indoor cycle instructor. So I come from the collegiate recreation side of things. I represent NERSA. I have been on the board before, and I also am currently serving on the board of directors for AOR, which is the Association of Outdoor Recreation and Education. My professional position is as Senior Associate Director at the University of Texas in San Antonio for the Department of Campus Recreation.
Thank you all. Such rich, wonderful introductions there. Maybe to say a little bit more about myself, and maybe in this particular moment, I thought it'd be helpful to share that, yesterday I got some really difficult news in that my last living grandmother needed to go to the hospital because she tested positive for COVID-19. She's 98 years old, incredible fighter. But I've always centered her teachings, the teachings of my grandmother and my mother's, in the way that I engage in this work and what it means to welcome people into a particular space. And so I wanted to bring her into this space of conversation as we think about, right, how to support the BIPOC community, particularly around our mental and physical well-being. And so one of the ways that I thought to do that was to kind of draw some inspiration from Audre Lorde as I introduce particular questions to the panel. And this one overarching question that I wanted to ask, again, the quote from Audre is that life is very short. What we have to do must be done in the now. My question to the panel is, given the times and the particular intersection of COVID-19 and the Black Lives Matter movement, what promising evolution or creation of policies and practices and programs have you seen this moment produce as it pertains to the care and support of BIPOC community members? And that was to all of you, so figure out how to jump in there. A little double Dutch routine right now. Don't be shy. Earl or Bati or Victoria, did anyone of y'all want to jump? Oh, thank you.
Sure, I can go first. I went first last time, so I was trying to be mindful of that, but I'm happy to start. And just to also name a few of my identities, I identify as Black and I'm African. I'm from a small country in the southern part of Africa called Zimbabwe. So I just wanted to name that and hopefully add a little bit of context to some of my comments. I think in response to that question, I was trying to think about specific policies that were coming to mind as I was thinking about my institution. I'm trained as a counseling psychologist, so I think some of my work ends up being, very centered around mental health concerns and within the counseling center. And I would say that the thing that I've noticed the most, sort of beyond specific policies, is the role of validation and bearing witness to something in terms of the suffering of the communities of color that have been impacted in really significant ways. And I think in some ways that suffering wasn't always recognized or validated. And I think what's come out of that recognition is a sense of needing to act, right? Like I think there's something about feeling like, it's not enough for us to just kind of observe and kind of validate. There needs to be action that's followed. So I think some of the things that have come up, at least when I've thought about my own institution, is more focused trainings around some of the specific issues that our students face, as well as new positions that have been focused on issues that communities of colors experience. And I think that has felt really meaningful to see that work be done. But I think there's something about this shared witnessing of suffering that I think has shifted. And I think when COVID started, we were starting to see a lot of the suffering that specific communities were experiencing, and BIPOC communities in particular. And I think that initially maybe that was not quite acknowledged in the ways that it should have been. And then now we're really seeing the intersection of COVID and the uprisings, and really recognizing just how much of a toll this is taking on our communities, and really thinking about how to be creative and understanding what is needed. So yeah, those are some of my thoughts as I'm thinking about that question.
Thank you, Bati.
Yeah, just to piggyback off of that, I'll start from an association level from NERSA, Leaders in Collegiate Recreation, and just, just creating space for our members to dialogue about this, and creating some of the spaces like the caucuses and just different opportunities for members, at least within the profession of campus recreation, to really discuss and get their hands dirty on like, what are we going to do with this, and some action items to kind of bring back to your campuses. So that's one appreciation from an association that I'm really grateful for. As I look on our campus, we have a new president, Dr. Daryl Pines, who literally started in June. And we also have a new vice president of student affairs, Dr. Patty Perillo, who both have, it's been nice to see the consistent messaging come across this initiative of being actively anti-racist. And I think, being able to kind of have that call to action but also put some meat to that plan and creating these affinity spaces, both within the Division of Student Affairs and just what Dr. Pines is kind of messaging to the campus community and giving opportunities for BIPOC communities to come together and share their concerns. And then I'll say from a departmental level, I've appreciated how our department has really rallied around this core value of inclusion, equity, and diversity. We have a kind of diversity inclusion committee that is committed to educational content of our 46 professional staff, and then again to all of the student employees that we work with. And just doing these educational sessions and dialogue around what's happening in the world today. Even this morning, we had our Office of Diversity Inclusion come up and talk to us about white supremacy culture within our organization. And I'm really proud of the work that we're doing to get in front of it. And it's really messy. It's really messy and it's really hard. But I think, to be a part of a department that really wants to unearth a lot of this stuff so we can move forward for our students is really important to me. So those are kind of some of the things that kind of stuck out to me as it pertains to your question. So.
Thank you, Earl.
I really appreciated the additional presence of language and the frequency of use of some words that maybe were scary in the past, like white supremacist, like anti-Black, like racist, being anti-racist, equity, justice. Like those are now part of the lexicon. And I think, Luis, you had also mentioned in previous correspondence, BIPOC, right? So this is new language to some, and for others, it's like, I'm so glad somebody else is starting to talk about this and just name it and say it, and let's own it and recognize that it exists. I really am excited that more people are using that language.
Thank you. Thank you very much. This question, I had scheduled that for both Bati and for Victoria, but again, folks, feel free to jump in. I'm going to frame this again by quoting Audre Lorde. So caring for myself is not self-indulgence. It is self-preservation. And that is an act of political warfare. My question to y'all, from your perspective, what are the biggest challenges in supporting BIPOC community members' mental well-being right now? Y'all are being so kind to each other.
Well, from my perspective, I think one of the biggest challenges in supporting the community is the community is also being taxed for being the people to hold the space and to have conversations. So we are both trying to take care of ourselves and talk and advocate. So I think it is challenging to do both. And how do you support people through that, right? So I want to be an advocate. I want to continue to have my voice, but I need to be like you. I'm inaccessible right now, and be okay with not being accessible right now. So I think that is a challenge. And I think the other piece is then from the community telling other people, like, you got to show up and you got to do the work too. Like it can't be the extra taxation on communities of color to continue to do this work. So if you are scared, if you think that it's going to take hard work, yep, it is scary and it is hard work. Exactly. And when we need help, we need other people to start using the language and holding space and doing those things.
Yeah, and just to add to Victoria, I agree. I think, part of it is, asking others to kind of weigh in and kind of be that voice for BIPOC community that is not BIPOC community members that have to hold the mantle and drive this initiative. And so, the only thing I'll add to that is, making sure that our spaces are, and I'll use the word psychologically safe, where community members can feel that they can be vulnerable and that they can be very safe. And I'll use myself as an example. I think being a student affairs professional for over 16 years, you're taught all these things of what professionalism is and all this stuff. And I know for me personally, I've kind of had to rewind the clock and look back and reflect on some of the things that maybe happened personally, professionally, that I have to kind of unearth myself, right? And as someone who grew up in Rhode Island, which is predominantly white, I went to Bowling Green State University that was predominantly white, and now I'm at an institution that's very diverse. And when some people just, kind of have that revelation later on. And we have to create spaces for those people who have kind of been around the block and making sure that their voice is heard. And as you unpack a lot of this stuff, and COVID has kind of been the environment now where people have a lot more time to reflect. But yeah, I would just add that creating these psychologically safe spaces for people to really unpack what's being done on campus. And the reality is that, again, we can't serve students if we're not taking care of ourselves. And so those are just two things that I wanted to add to that question.
Yeah, and both of what's been shared by Earl and Victoria is sort of similar, along the similar lines that I was thinking about, which is I think we're juggling so much. I think in a context of a lot of loss, a lot of racial trauma, family and life obligations. We're all in the middle of the uncertainty that COVID has brought, and I feel like, as Victoria was mentioning, and then also doing this work in addition to that. So I feel like because we're juggling so many things, trying to make sure that we don't lose sight of ensuring that BIPOC communities have adequate access to care, because I think that's been a barrier in the past and it continues to be a barrier now. How do we make sure that we're still really centering the mental health of BIPOC communities, but also making sure that we're recognizing the need for that? I think we were talking about, self-care earlier, but just really thinking about how will we be differentiating between this idea of coping and healing, right? Because in some ways we can sort of use those two things and sort of assume that they're the same thing, especially for BIPOC communities. And I think we, within all our cultures, have a lot of wisdom around what healing looks like, and really thinking about what resources are we dedicating to making sure that we're really working towards healing and not just coping, and making sure that there's actually systemic change that is reducing a lot of these disparities and reducing the weight of what BIPOC communities often have to manage on a daily basis. But I think this current situation is just kind of adding layers of complexities and concerns that BIPOC communities have to work through.
I want to touch on it because it reminded me, and it's something that I talk about, and we have conversations around like space and how we access it and how it also impacts our mental well-being, right? So thinking about now during COVID, like what are some things you can do? Right now, the biking industry is exploding, right? But who are the people who get to do that? People who have money, right? Who have the ability to buy that equipment, to access that equipment. You can't buy a bike right now. Like I was on a wait list for months to try to get a bike, right? To be able to go outdoors and be outdoors. And, in AOR, we talk about, very frankly, the outdoor space. When you think about, let me go outdoors, let me access the outdoors for my own personal well-being, who is the outdoors for? It's for white, wealthy men. So how are we starting to now look systemically at what are the messages that we have been sending? What are the systems and practices in place that don't allow people of color or BIPOC community to show up as themselves, to just show up and be themselves in these spaces? And then you add on the layers of complexity. Well, what space? Whose space? Who owns that space? What's the history of that space, right? So coming into it with those other historical, generational types of heavy and weightness that goes into that too. Is like, how do we engage in that? How do you start to unpack that? And I feel like now during this time, it is even a more heightened awareness of who owns space, what is space, what is your connection to the earth, to our environment, how can you engage in activities that will help your well-being? Has your community been systemically removed from engaging in some of those activities that could actually help with your own mental well-being, other aspects of your well-being too?
Thank you all for that. Part of what each of you were commenting on reminded me of language that I've started to try to use. I do use the word love in the way that I think about my work and my engagement with students. And again, this is really informed by and inspired by the way that my grandmothers and my mothers raised me, right? Ways of welcoming people in. But the word is querencia, right? Which is I'm not a fan of bullfighting, but it's a place where the bull goes in the arena where they draw strength and support, right? And so how, thinking about these notions of creating not just a space, but that there are multiple spaces, that there are multiple pathways where you can draw strength and support. Typically there are locations, there are individuals, and I think part of what each of you are addressing is both this kind of on a systemic and organizational level is the responsibility that folks have, that we have, right, for creating those multiple pathways and spaces where querencia is possible, right? I wanted to ask, and again, each of you could feel free to jump in, but this one I had scheduled for Earl, again, introducing it by quoting Lord. When I dare to be powerful, to use my strength in the service of my vision, then it becomes less and less important whether I am afraid. Earl, as you think about this particular moment, how do you expect issues of racism to manifest themselves on your campus this fall? How are we prepared? How are you prepared to address these issues within your campus and functional area? There's quite a few questions here. I hope you have some of this in front of you. How are you preparing your staffs to attend to these issues, resources that you might have for folks here? So there's a lot there. I could cut and paste into our chat to make sure that you have that all in front of you there.
No, you're good. I'll start off with the students and just some things that we are doing within our own institution, our department, to equip and armor up our students with knowledge, right? And so, obviously there's a lot of us doing trainings and virtual trainings, and we're really leveraging that to have some prep work on the students' end as it deals with conflict management. Part of being a recreation professional is maybe having to deal with some unhappy patrons and whatnot, and equipping them with strategies and tools and how to manage that. And we know some of those situations can get messy. And so, looking into our kind of development program for our students as it pertains to equity, diversity, inclusion is something we're working on. And specifically, the University of Maryland has a student affairs diversity initiative framework that we use as kind of the framework we have for our students. And so it's grounded in 4 kind of buckets. And so it's like knowing yourself, understanding others, power and privilege, and practicing inclusion. And so we work with our students on all 4 of these to kind of build off of each other to help them create, really safe spaces for our community members. And so that's just some way we're trying to kind of get in with our students in terms of, ways that we can address some of those issues. For, I guess, our professional staff, as I alluded to earlier, we're always trying to kind of lead the way when it comes to this work, and, making sure that we are equipping us with knowledge for this work. And, whether it's monthly staff meetings or coffee and conversations, we're doing our part to kind of kind of build towards this like anti-racist type of space that we're trying to create in our campus. So those are just some of the things more broadly that, that we're doing at the University of Maryland.
I was curious about, this isn't one of those questions I posted, so I apologize, because this question around issues of racism that have occurred. I mean, I think, you know, ideally our campuses are places where these conversations have happened. And, you know, early last year, there was this kind of pushback on cancel culture, right? So things would crop up and there'd be this really strong response to what people were posting online and people being, right, called out, if you will, on behavior. And then this recent summer, there's been a critique of the cancel culture, right? Not critique of the cancel culture. There's a necessity for it to happen in this particular moment. And so I'm curious about how folks are planning to deal with the particular tension of addressing these issues of racism and still keeping people connected to the community at a particular moment where people may just want to cancel someone. Does that make sense? There's some friction there, and I'm curious about how folks are planning to help our students and maybe even help our own staff members navigate that tension. That's a surprise question. If you don't have an answer, that's okay.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the first thing that comes to mind, and when I think about the conversations we've been having on the board for AUCCO, is just really encouraging a lot of dialogue as much as we can, even if it's difficult, right? Even if there are missteps within that. And I think those are also the things we're trying to take back to each of our institutions is how do we still engage in meaningful dialogue that feels like it's moving things forward, as opposed to potentially silencing, especially for BIPOC communities, or in a way that feels like it's not necessarily contributing to where we want to go as an organization and then for each of our institutions. So shortly after George Floyd's murder, AUCCO had a series of kind of community gatherings. Some were by affinity group, and then some were white accountability groups by some of our board members. And I think it was just a way of modeling, like, yeah, we can have this conversation. And then by learning how to have this conversation within our organization, we can take it back to our institutions and think about how to have that conversations with our peers, and then think about how to have those conversations with our students, and then hoping that it continues to sort of ripple out on our campus. And of course, really acknowledging the harm that has taken place at times when we've tried to have those communications. So even as an organization, when we were crafting our statement, thinking a little bit about the tension that came out around making sure, who is the focus of the statement, who is really, visible as we're making these comments. And I think as hard as it's been, it's also just been enriching in terms of changing our culture and making sure that we're not also getting to a place where we have to be so cautious of each other and not necessarily pushing each other to continue to grow, and recognizing that that growth can only take place within the community. It can't really take place with us like not communicating or not being able to sort of dialogue with each other. So when I thought about your comment, that's your question, that's the first thing that came to mind, is just like, we're trying to do this work together and in community and trying to push each other as much as we can, but also recognizing when harm has been caused, which I think is a big part of that process as well.
Thank you. We have a couple of questions that have come in, and I don't know if y'all can see them, but I'll go ahead and read them to the group. This one is from Colson Thomas. They appreciated Victoria's comment about people of color in the outdoors and recognized the wellness benefits of being with nature. And then they often felt that by the time they get to us, it is hard to engage them, like being students, in something new like the outdoors. What strategies can be effective in making our students of color comfortable with doing something different, like participating in the outdoors and making that connection with their wellness?
Well, I would first right depend on what your community looks like. So I'm going to speak from UTSA as being a Hispanic serving institution. And we've been challenged to be a Hispanic thriving institution instead of just service and basic needs. So I think for us and at UTSA, there's primarily first generation college students. We are an HSI. Most of our students work. So just the cost of things is a barrier for our students. So we come from the philosophy of we want to charge either nothing or break even with whatever the costs are of the program. So I think whatever impacts might be for prohibiting people, or I'm sorry, putting barriers up to participation and when it might come to finances. Another great thing that we have talked about is working with our DACA Center, and in particular, reaching those students and thinking about how we integrate their experience and heritage and culture and the outdoors together. So how might our sense of place and connection to land, the importance of water, and integrating that into the experience of being outdoors. And so like something along the lines of a land acknowledgement, talking about the indigenous roots and history of a particular place that we're going to. And there's also then some of the easy kind of stuff that is like, do you see people that look like you on the posters? I mean, like, are the people who look like you who are across the counter, who are offering you these things? There are also opportunities to then show, right? So to be able to show and demonstrate. Let's talk about how do we open up a tent? Like, how do we open up a tent and how do we set that up and what does that look like and how do you take it down? And let's sit with you and let's have that conversation and education at that point in time. I think there are other opportunities to then think about, when you think about your staff, who are the leaders, who are the ones who are curating those trips, and what is important to whatever your particular population might be focused on. I think we also struggle getting women in the outdoors as well. So how do we get more women who may have had experience outdoors or have want a desire to get outdoors? And as we think about, then you're able to use that space as a time to unpack issues that are important to women. What I love about the outdoors, and specifically when it comes to gathering in the outdoors, it's a vessel to engage in dialogue and conversations and explore things that maybe just you can't do in a conference room. One of the things that I often refer to is, the outdoors and Mother Nature. She is blissfully simple and brutally honest. So going out and setting up, what are some things that you might be able to self-discover for yourself? That interweaving, right, of self-discovery, personal discovery, leadership, being able to summit a hill, and how do we start to connect that into our own personal power, in particular of thinking about women, thinking about the BIPOC community. There are ways I think we have to integrate it and find the intersectionality of these spaces, and also then talking about it. So thinking about even just swim lessons, right? Offering swim lessons to the Black community and being like, hey, we understand and recognize and the hurt, right? Being able to talk about that, and how do we then target the community or find other people that we can engage and start to really to help frame and educate and be open to it at the same time.
Appreciate that. Certainly these particular questions around who is afforded leisure, right? And the particular privilege of leisure that I think is associated with spending time outdoors. This isn't a question rather than, I think one of the things that we're struggling with here on our campus that I'm trying to work with our own athletic department, who has significant ownership of some really, good outdoor space that is really restricted to a very specific group of members on our community, right? Our student athletes. And in a semester where they're canceling, fall seasons, I'm trying to encourage them that there is an opportunity to build particular bridges between our student and our student athletes here, and having them access spaces that they may want to beyond the soccer field, even though they're not on the soccer team, so on and so forth. So, I'm curious to see where that goes and how, our athletics department sees themselves as part of this possible bridging of access to space that they may be aware of, but again, not accessible to them historically here on our campus. So Lord wrote, only by learning to live in harmony with your contradictions can you keep it all afloat. And I asked, I used that particular quote as I asked this question, is what advice would you offer to students and colleagues in the majority who wish to be allies and support BIPOC community members, but do not know how or are worried about making a mistake? And we have an anonymous attendee kind of maybe add some specificity to this question is, what are your thoughts on how to navigate the boundary in higher education between white folks wanting to support BIPOC community members and for many, for the first time, without being white saviorism? Savior, I think I got that right. White saviorism. So I thought those two questions lined up really well. But again, thoughts that y'all have on folks in the majority wishing to be allies, how to do that, how to work through your mistakes, or in the way that Audrey says here, how to live in harmony with your contradictions.
I think when I think about this question, I think the fear of making mistakes should not be the reason not to engage. Like even as a Black person, like I make mistakes all the time in terms of, assumptions I might make, or, things that I need to grow and learn. So I think I want to sort of make sure that we move away from a place of not wanting to make mistakes, because then I think it also stifles our ability to grow and figure out how to do it, the right way. But I think one of the things that comes to mind when I think about allyship is making sure that when people show up, that you show up consistently, and that care and investment is consistent. I think, something that happened, I think, to a lot of folks that are, in my circle was, as the uprisings were happening, getting a lot of texts, from a lot of people around, like, how are you doing? And it's very much appreciated. But it's also been interesting to see how it sort of, falls out after a while, right? Like, it's like the first day you get a lot of texts. But obviously for a lot of folks who are marginalized, for BIPOC communities, like this is something you're living with every single day. So just really thinking about how can you show sort of consistency within your allyship role, that just because in some ways you can kind of opt in and out, for communities of color, that's not an option, like you don't necessarily experience something one day and then not another. So just really thinking about how can you show up and show up consistently. And it's not about getting things perfect. It's just really, investing and making sure that you are sort of, walking alongside folks and trying to figure out a way to really connect in a way that feels genuine and supportive of, whatever community you're trying to support. So that's what I would say to that question.
I'll just add on to that. I guess for me, for those who want to show allyship, I really believe it shows up in the everyday, right? Like, it's the water cooler talk. It's the comments that are just so subtle, right? In our everyday dialogue as coworkers. And I think, trying to be a very active bystander, it's almost like the see something, say something. And so I've appreciated when, allies have really spoke up when we're talking about a certain colleague of color and identifying them as being lazy, and really have no backing to it. So I think for me, that's what kind of shows up when someone, again, comes to you and wants to help. And to that point of not being perfect and getting it right, I think that's important. But I think there's this other layer of, what is the everyday interaction and how can you be better about kind of identifying those behaviors and calling them out? Because I think that's what slowly kind of changes culture and allows people to, again, really check their own biases and their own behavior. So just something to add on to that.
You thinking about jumping in, Victoria? I see the pensando ahí.
I'll be thinking. the white savior, the whole white savior thing. I have two feelings on it. Number one, I think it's important that that the white people like stand up and do the work too. And so whenever this comes at you as like, oh, you're a white savior, and you're like, what do I do? Well, welcome, right? Like when you're trying to do the work, you're trying to do something and people are like, oh, you're not doing it right, or you are approaching it in this way. I think that it takes the consistency, right? Like, so Earl said, the day-to-day stuff, you just have to keep doing it, and the work is going to speak for itself. And you are gonna face that. And if you feel as though that you are a true ally and you're doing this and you're in this for the long haul, it's gonna come at you.
Yeah, I agree with you. It's not quite analogous. We have mentioned before. Actually, I didn't mention that I have 4 children, and I'm trying to think about ways in which I engage them. There's this like universal way that I can engage them, and then there's this like there's a needed specificity. Each of them have some different needs. And I guess I just want to say that, particularly for folks in majority, for white folk, yes, that way of engaging in individuals you knew may not work the same with the next set of people that you're trying to provide support. And I like there's a need to check in with folks. There's a need to engage in conversation, understand the needs, understand their voice and their own agency in these spaces, to ensure that there's appropriate is not the right word. It's just like that the intention meets the impact that you desire, right? So there's just, and that there's messiness in that, in trying to sort through. And this is where, there's bound to be some pushback. When trying, if I could like not center white folks, but actually continue to center BIPOC communities, and I'm wondering about the allyship that y'all feel is needed within BIPOC communities and the various identities. Me showing up for Earl is I would say, right, distinct than me showing up for Bati and for Victoria. And this is me knowing very little about all of you, the whole of you. But I'm curious about the varied identities within BIPOC communities and how we are supposed to show up for each other. Any thoughts on that? There was a question in there somewhere. I'm hoping you picked it up.
Luis, we have to. Like, we got to show up. And we got to be able to do it within our own communities. So I'll speak for my community and how I identify. And we got language. We got language we use that is derogatory and anti-Black. There's colorism that exists within the Latinx, diaspora. What we value. Mejor la raza, you know what I mean? Like these kinds of things of like, let's make things better, let's make things whiter. That's what we value more. That's the conversation that we gotta have with each other and call out with each other so that we can show up for our other community members.
Yeah, I agree. As a Filipinx, our community, I mean, truthfully, just family members, and the anti-Black rhetoric that is in the Filipinx community, that's on me, and that's on those who identify to kind of stand up to our titos and titas, and we are a culture that is built on hierarchy. You never question Lola and Lolo, your elders, and we're finding as a community that like they're complicit in some of this rhetoric, right? And that's where I'm trying to be better of showing up and really, again, getting our hands dirty in this conversation. And, I always bring it back to my 4-year-old, and I have to teach him ways that maybe might be contradictory to kind of how we grew up, and being very deliberate with that and not kind of feeding into that. And so I'll say that for the Filipinx community, but that's, as Victoria was mentioning, that that kind of popped in my head.
Yeah, I resonate with what's been shared. I think something that I've often tried to remind myself is, who benefits from the narrative of us, BIPOC community or Black folks not getting along, right? Like, who's invested in that continuing to be the case, right? And how does that impact our communities when we don't show up for each other and we're not invested in collective healing? So I was think a lot about how colonization and racism, white supremacy sort of thrives on us actually not being aligned at all. And how do we continue to recognize that as part of how the system sort of influences us to think of ourselves as so different from each other, rather than really thinking about really investing in each other's communities in a way that actually pushes all of us forward. So that's the only thing I'll add from what was shared. But I resonate with both Earl and Victoria's comment on that.
Thank you. And it does feel, I think, kind of like that similar advice that we were providing for folks in the majority is that our work is also messy, that our work is also, will come with some bumps, that I will get called out by folks in the queer community as I'm trying to be an ally to them, at least trying to provide support, and in the hopes that they would see me in that way, right? They're not identities that I hold, but communities that I understand that I need to be in alignment with in terms of these efforts for, well-being, liberation. So appreciate the comments there. Thank y'all. There is this one question here. I'm not quite sure if I understood it correctly, and I don't know if y'all are looking at the same thing. I don't know what the MENA, but in the MENA region, does somebody know what that might mean? Universities, white supremacy in student affairs leadership has been institutionalized to the point where it had overridden experience. How are we supposed to deal in such a situation? And I'm not, the framing here, I might need to do, Middle East, North Africa. Wow, okay. Thank you for clarifying that. I appreciate that. I actually, one of the ways for me to think about this particular question is one of the ways that I've been framing, as I look at all of our institutions. There's language, there's the PWI language for me is limiting, right? It is, that is a particular state, right? It's a being. In the moment, we are a predominantly white institution, but it does not do anything to contextualize that institution, right? In the way that a historically Black college and university does, right? That contextualizes the space. So we should use the language of historically white college and university. We don't. We also don't use the same language that we use for HSIs, right? Hispanic serving institutions, right? We do that because there's a particular percentage of those populations that exist on those campuses say, hey, we are serving a particular population differently. But we don't use that for white serving institutions. We don't do WSI, right? Because there's something about not just simply naming the demographics, but naming a particular context and history of these institutions that I think is important when we are talking about white supremacy. And so I don't think it's specific to the MENA region, right? That I think inherently all of our colleges and universities are PWI, historically white, and white serving, and thus, right, a particular way in which white supremacy has been institutionalized historically in these places. So I'm curious about, that's a big question. What exactly, how do we start to unearth some of this or excavate? I think you used it earlier, you used the language of unearth maybe, but the necessity for excavating how white supremacy has permeated or has a particular permanence in the practices or in the institutions that we belong to. Again, I think there's a question there, but in unearthing and excavation. Any thoughts? It's a big question. Okay. I might get that a few more times.
I'm not quite sure if this is an answer to your question, but here's what came to my mind is ways of knowing, ways of knowledge building. It is a colonialized framework that we work within. how do we open up to other ways of knowing, and then honoring and holding those other ways of knowledge, of gaining knowledge. I'm not quite sure if I'm making sense. We're trying to understand it, but that's where I went to, right? Like we're in this box of what it is. But what's also wonderful about being in higher education is that there are other ways of doing and thinking and valuing lived historical knowledge, practice, ways of learning that we need to also then open up, hold space for, and open our minds to, and then value.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think I was thinking along, I think, similar lines of just really thinking about where some of these practices came from, right? There's so much that I think to the question that was being asked, so much that we adopt without ever questioning where it came from. Like, why do we even do things the way we do? Like, I think to Victoria's comment, like, are there different ways of approaching things? And it's not just in sort of like big concepts in terms of like higher education, but even when we think about perfectionism or timeliness or, just like day-to-day things sometimes that we just take for granted and we just accept that this is how it needs to be. Or when we think about hierarchy within the classroom or hierarchy in our institutions, there's just so much that we just accept. And even just thinking about, to Victoria's comment of knowledge, like who is the holder of that knowledge? And why don't we see, sometimes our students being like the wise ones in the room, right? As opposed to sort of thinking like, oh, we're the ones who are supposed to give them knowledge in some way. So just really thinking about who in our institutions or who in each of our environments do we value, and why do we value them that way? And are there other ways that we could be thinking about this and thinking about the origins of where that comes from? Because I also want to add that, some of the things that we adopt as coming, from white culture are actually things that have been appropriated, right? And sort of represented to us as something different when these things actually originated from BIPOC communities and are just kind of reframed in a different way. So those are some thoughts that came up. I hope that answered the question too, but it made me think a lot about origins and what we value and sort of where that comes from.
And I don't have much to add to that because I think you both summarized it really well, but I'll put in simplest terms, part of my role is HR, and I go back to who created this checkbox of things that you need to have this, you need to have professional staff supervision. Like, who wrote that? And why does that obstruct certain people from advancing into the profession? So I think what I'm hearing is more questions. And again, like, I think we need to create equity and access, and who is behind the curtain pulling the strings, and really speak truth to the power. So those are just some of the things that kind of resonated for me. And I know it's something that systemically is happening in our field of campus recreation specifically. And I think more broadly, it's happening at the top of our student affairs bubble. So.
Thank you. Again, I recognize that it's such a big question. And I think appropriately so, right? It kind of given some of the things that you were sharing before about the need for conversation, that a question like that, I think, deserves really, the responses are just more questions, right? So that we continue to engage in this kind of excavation. It's part of the reason why I think for me, some of the ways that I thought about that is the utility of language. My intention when I use the word love is that there's something about the academy that has discouraged me from engaging with that language, with my peers, with my colleagues, with students. But there's something very much about the academy that tells people, particularly folks from BIPOC communities, that it does not love them. And so if I'm in my role and I'm trying to express the things that I know that I learned from my grandma, from mi mama, right? That, love is that first step, that you welcome anyone that crosses the threshold of your home, of your campus in this particular way, and that language of love, however you want to define that or use it or express that, is absent and like I said, the academy encourages this particular absence. That for me is the acknowledgement of what's missing from the academy. There is the excavation of what's there, and this particular acknowledgement of, again, what isn't here, what isn't present. And it's the reason why I spend time talking about my grandmother. I spend time talking about my mother because, again, we tell students, welcome into this space. It's not, ideally we're telling them, we welcome you into the space. We welcome the gifts that you have. We welcome the gifts that your family have provided for you. And we want those lessons to be front and center in your education, right? In your continued education here. And again, there's something about the walls of the academy, the gates of the academy, that tells particularly BIPOC communities, you are in a different place. You are now in a gated community with a different set of rules in the way that you've engaged your life before here. And I want us to disrupt that. I want us to shake that up a bit. Conversations about outdoor space, but also just the ways in which we communicate with one another and what the barriers are and why those barriers are there. Who is served by me not being able to communicate that I approach my work with love, right? Who is served by that? All right, y'all got me. We got last few minutes here. There's this one heavier question, but I guess I'm just curious about here two things. Since I've ranted about my grandma, I'm wondering if there are lessons from your family that you want to share, your chosen family, your families, that you want to share with people and say, hey, this is a lesson from my family and that I carry with me. And two, something that you're doing for yourself to take care of yourself. And I'm gonna pick you because you're doing some good head nodding.
So I'll start with the last question first. I think trying to practice as much gratitude as I can to try to stay as grounded to what's going on. I feel like sometimes when you think about everything that's happening in our world, it can feel a little overwhelming. And I think just trying to have, some quiet time, but also just trying to practice gratitude given everything that's happening around us. And then I think lessons from family, I think, when you were talking about love, it made me think a lot about just kindness. I think one thing about Zimbabwean culture, and I'll say African-American culture as well, is like, it's very welcoming and like open. And I think there's something about believing in like the goodness of people that I think you are just kind of immersed in. And so I think those are the things that come to mind, is just kindness and thinking a lot about the goodness in people and being able to recognize that.
Thank you.
I'll start off with my family. Something about Filipinos in general, I know for me, is this devotion to being Catholic Christian. And I'm inspired by Mother Teresa, and she says, not all of us can do great things, but we can do small things with great love. And I'm reminded of that when I show up for my students, when I show up for those who I'm serving. And so that's one takeaway from my family that, I take with me and share. Self-care is a part of my practice as a campus recreation professional. And I think the one piece of advice that I would give people is to find time in silence, whether it's in prayer, whether it's in meditation, and trying to figure that out and give yourself room and space to just be. Is very powerful in these times because there's so much noise out there in the world. And I think there's a lot to be done when you're just in silence and one with whatever you believe in, whether it's nature or if it's a higher being. And so definitely finding time for meditation or being alone is important. So, Victoria.
I think that for me, it centers around food and familia coming together and passing down stories and sharing thoughts and ideas around that. And I think now because of COVID, like I'm at home, my kids are at home, and we're pulling out old tortilla recipes and making all kinds of salsas together. And we're trying things. And in doing that, right, that practice of not only just like things being passed down, but the conversations is what I love, like the gathering. Like, let's come together and we talk so we can uncover what is happening underneath the surface, right? So what's your day? How was your day? It was fine. But what is more about that? So I think that the coming together and gathering, breaking bread together, communicating is something that I think can be expanded upon in different areas. So I think that's a big lesson for me to always value that and coming together. And then taking care of myself, surprise, I go outdoors and by myself. So like to go with Earl, right? So it's like in the mornings, I take morning walks by myself and nobody else. So being by myself, that's how I recharge myself. And I have encouraged some of my staff, I'll do like, early morning one-on-one phone calls if we need to. Go outside, let's go for a walk together, and do it that way. So that's one way that I am continuing to take care of my well-being.
Thank you all. Again, I know that wasn't a question I provided up front, but felt like it was an appropriate place to land. So thank you very much. Lori, I think I'm going to be turning it back to you just with some closing comments and resources. But I want to just thank folks for joining us, and for Earl, Bati, and Victoria. It's been an absolute pleasure engaging in this conversation with each of you and learning a little bit more about you. If I could be of help to any one of you, please let me know.
All right, Louis, thank you so much. And I also wanted to say thank you to Louis for doing a great job moderating, and also all of our panelists. Great job, that was a great conversation. And before we end today, and you see on your screen there a link, a quick reminder that all of the programs in this mental health series have been recorded. They are viewable on the Akuwai YouTube channel, so we have provided the link there for you to go ahead and view those. And if you have anyone on your teams that might have missed them, please feel free to also direct them there as well. So again, a big thank you to our panelists, and also to the listening audience for joining us and spending time with us this afternoon. I certainly enjoyed hearing the expertise from all of our panelists today. So on behalf of Akuwai, NERSA, and ACCCO, we look forward to seeing you soon again in the virtual space. Take good care, everyone.